Hey, welcome to the Purple and Bold podcast from DNR Media and the Daily News Record. I'm Shane Metlin here again with Katie Harper to discuss all things JMU sports, as we always do. Coming off spring football, we haven't done an episode since the abbreviated spring game. We can recap just what what was seen and heard and everything throughout spring football. Katie and I both have had like some in-depth interviews here in the last couple of days. She sat in with Billy Napier for almost an hour. I did the same with Matt Roan. So a few things we can kind of discuss from those conversations about, where JMU football and sports in general are heading. And, as the spring rolls on, college basketball offseason continues. And, the offseason begins for one JMU sport. A little bit of a disappointing into the season for JMU softball as they were playing well heading into the Sun Belt tournament, but only end up with that 6th seed. So, you're running into a pretty good team in the first round, a team that's got, multiple, all Sun Belt and Sun Belt award winners on their roster in Texas State. And JMU looked really good for 5-6 innings before it kind of fell apart there late in the game. And they end up going home from the Sun Belt tournament early and calling it a season and another not terrible, but somewhat disappointing season for JMU softball.
Yeah, I was watching the game yesterday to cover it, and it was one of those where the more they left people on base, the more it started to feel like they were playing with fire. They, going into that game, everything Lauren Laporte was saying was that they needed to capitalize off the pitching if they could against Texas State, because Texas State did have the pitcher of the year in the circle yesterday, and they were doing that. They had the bases loaded in the first inning, they had the bases loaded a couple innings later. And each time they just couldn't capitalize, which is why, they only took that 2-0 lead into the bottom of the 6th inning. And the longer that went on, it just seemed like it wasn't going to go JMU's favor. And eventually, Texas State was going to figure out Peyton List and find a way to score some runs. And that's inevitably what ended up happening there in the 6th, where, the first couple batters of the order get on, a home run gets hit, and it's just kind of at that point, not only did Texas State tie the game, they built a lead that JMU was going to struggle to come back from with only 3 outs to work with in the 7th. So definitely a heartbreaking loss the way they fell. And it seemed the more that game went on, it was, something that was going to be hard to avoid if JMU couldn't get those clutch hits.
Yeah, something that's plagued them at times here over the past couple seasons really is that, inability to maybe maximize your good innings and leaving runners on base. And what looks like at the start could be, a 3, 4, 5 run inning, only getting 1 or 2 across the plate. And that definitely was the case. This one, maybe it seemed like maybe they were getting better in that regard here late in the season because it was a good finish to the season, especially winning that series against Marshall. To end the regular season. But yeah, it's probably going to haunt Lauren Laporte and some of these players that are coming back for the next, several months before they get back to work, knowing they left so many runners on base. And if you get past Texas State in the opening round, then who knows, what happens the rest of that tournament.
It's definitely something that I think they're going to think about for a while, like you said. And, even when you look around this roster, they have a lot of players that could potentially be back next season, which, having this experience is a good experience in the grand scheme of it. But it now kind of turns the attention quickly on to managing the roster, getting the players back that have some eligibility left still for them. And I think even going into next season, regardless of what happens with players entering the transfer portal or not, I think, JMU needs to maybe look a little bit more at pitching. It was something that at times this year really ended up being a weak spot for them. I don't think Peyton List and Kirsten Fleet ever necessarily found the game that they were hoping for and maybe that the staff was hoping for. Over the last couple of weeks, I think we started to see Peyton List kind of, settle in and get her game going, and same with Fleet. But it seemed like, especially early on in the year, that those kind of standards that people had grown accustomed to having set for those two specifically just weren't necessarily reached as much as maybe they should have been. And, at the same time, you have a younger pitcher in Taylor Johnson, who kind of a rarity already being a lefty. And she played well, and especially in the middle portion to the end of the season. And that's someone that maybe, you can keep around and have her keep developing as she gets older, but it may be something where they need to look and see, is it enough to just move forward with these kind of three key players as pitchers?
Yeah. And, the rest of the spring sports at JMU are kind of, moving towards that end of the season. We are recording this. I'll hopefully have it up and online, be a little bit of a lead into NCAA tournament for JMU lacrosse, as they're in Illinois at Northwestern to take on Notre Dame in the first round, with possible matchup with Notre Dame, or not Notre Dame, with Northwestern waiting for them if they can win that one. So we don't have to get too much into that because we don't know what's going to happen there. But for JMU baseball, getting towards the end, last couple regular season series here, and more than likely probably the end of the season, they've got to do, if not sweep series, they've got to definitely win series to have any chance of making the Sun Belt tournament here. And with Southern Miss coming to town, that's going to be a challenge, like with this weekend coming up.
The good news for the baseball team is that, the 6th seed through the 13th seed in the Sun Belt right now are all a jumbled mess. There are a bunch of 10-win teams, a bunch of 11 team wins, 11-win teams in conference play. So that's the good news for JMU. The bad news, like you said, is that they're playing Southern Miss, which is the number 2 team in the Sun Belt, and is not kind of facing this jumbled mess of standings around them. It's pretty much Coastal Carolina, Southern Miss, and then everyone else outside of kind of Georgia Southern. They're a little too far behind the middle of the pack to even make a difference. So that is the good news is there is a fighting chance for JMU. They have Southern Miss this weekend and ODU next weekend, and in the grand scheme of it all, they're lucky that they're getting Southern Miss in Harrisonburg. Maybe you can hope for at least a little bit of some kind of advantage playing the series in Harrisonburg, but by no means does that mean it's going to be an easy one. They need to have, probably the best pitching they've had all year, which I know we talked about it with softball. Baseball pitching arguably been even worse. It's been very inconsistent at times. You have some players that have kind of been the go-to option and have done well and have still hit kind of some rough patches. But you look at, the last couple of weeks, you have your Sunday starter, Tyler Lutz, throwing really, really well. But you can't just rely on one starter on a weekend series, especially at this point. You need your Friday night guy, you need your Saturday night guy to show up and really just kind of give this team a boost moving into this final week of the regular season. Because if they want to make the Sun Belt tournament for the first time since that 2024 year, that they need these arms to step up.
Yeah. And, like we said, we're back here recording for the first time since the spring game, which was really only one offensive series for JMU football in the spring game. We didn't get to see a whole lot out of that, but you did get to sit down with Billy Napier, talk about a variety of things. So I'll let you first, give me your overall impressions on spring football, more from, practices than spring game, other than I'm sure everybody was probably a little bit excited to see JC Evans throw it deep when he had never gotten the opportunity to do that in a game. He can throw it down the field. So the one little peek we did get there, but overall, what did you take away from spring practices before we get into that conversation with Billy?
I think there are a lot of potential playmakers on especially the offensive side of the ball. People did see it in that 5-play spring game a little bit with Corey Scott going up to catch JC Evans's pass. He, I think, has the potential to be a very, very good receiver for JMU. He's someone who was actually he was offered by JMU out of high school, but it wasn't a committable offer. And I know we've talked about that before, that some of these offers that are handed out, you can't commit to them. They're just kind of there. And so that was kind of his case. And he ended up at West Florida and is now making that jump. I think he has been someone that really stood out to me throughout the spring. And I think has the potential to be very, very good. Obviously, the quarterback position right now, still very much up in the air. I think people maybe have an idea of who they expect to be the starting quarterback. I think it's a very talented room across the board, and they each kind of have a different skill set that they bring. I will say, just being out at practice, the leadership of someone like Camden Coleman is very clear. That he at least has been around a lot of these players for over a year now, or about a year at this point. So he's been impressive to me from a leadership perspective. And then even on the defensive side of the ball, I think we talked about it leading into the spring game. Guys like KJ Flo have really seemed to take that step forward and have continuously gotten some praise from guys like Billy Napier, Robert Bala, Dave Plungus. He's someone that I think will grow into that role kind of left behind by DJ Barksdale.
Yeah. You mentioned all these names and all the question marks, and I know I've kind of been amused here in recent weeks as everybody kind of wraps up spring. You see different lists across social media of people ranking like group of 5 players or Sunbelt players at various positions and stuff. And I'll see a name and I'll be like, yeah, maybe like that JMU guy belongs right there, but I don't even know if he's going to start. Like, or he may be the best in the country, like at the G5 level. I don't know. It's really, I'm trying to think of an off season quite like this for JMU, where I think everybody feels pretty good about the talent level that's there, but then still so many question marks about, okay, who's actually going to be on the field when they get started here. Well, I guess I get started practicing probably in July, but by August, I think we'll probably have some idea, maybe what a depth chart possibly looks like, but so many question marks at this point.
I think too, when you compare it to Bob Chesney's first year, I would say that I think there may be a little bit more certainty with Napier's first roster than Chesney's. I don't know, at least from the covering perspective, Chesney's first roster to me felt like a lot more, or it was filled with a lot more question marks, just because of, I feel like the turnover was even more drastic from Signetti to him with the transfer portal. I think this year's roster, the fact that Napier was able to bring back guys like, a George Petaway, an Amar Thomas, a KJ Flo, a Zach Greenberg, these guys who have played meaningful snaps and been in meaningful moments either last season or 2 years ago for JMU. I think they're a little bit I think there are just less question marks when you look at this roster as a whole, that they were able to go out and supplement those missing pieces with guys that have kind of already proven themselves, whether it be at the FCS level or the Division II or Division III level.
Yeah, I think a couple things play into that too is, we're probably just getting more used to the idea of guys from lower level moving up. Like, you think about a couple of years ago and it was like, oh, like they're getting all these FCS guys. Do you think they're going to be able to make the transition? And now I think maybe you trust the coaches a little bit more about recruiting guys from that level. And also no spring portal. I mean, you think back to a couple of years ago, you're going through spring practice feeling great about having D'Angelo Pons, and then all of a sudden you don't. And that's just like one more position where it becomes a question mark. So I think there's a couple things that make it just feel a little bit more comfortable as everything just kind of evolves on how these coaching transitions work.
Well, the spring portal being removed was something I talked with Billy Napier about yesterday when I sat down with him. And he has been vocal even before our conversation yesterday. He was vocal throughout kind of the spring season that he was very happy that the spring portal was removed. And yesterday he talked about the fact that it's taking out, that portal now being gone is taking out a large chunk section of work that they would have to do at this point of the year. That extra effort is now gone. They don't have to sit back down, reevaluate what they have left on the roster. And he kind of referred to it as, these kids aren't walking around anymore with like a parachute on their back that they can just pull whenever they want. That is now gone. And he said, you're working January through December. You're working a whole year with these guys because they don't have that option to leave. And there are a lot of benefits to it. It says he thinks it teaches them commitment, which maybe is something that has been lost over the last couple of years, that they have to commit and buy into, this team and this process for a whole year to really get better. And I asked him too if he thought it was something that, come September, October, November, when you're getting into the season, if it was something that fans were going to notice about the product that there was no spring portal. And he really does think that people are going to be able to tell a difference by what's put out on the field because they've eliminated that spring transfer portal.
Yeah, perfect transition. Tell me more about sitting down with Billy Napier yesterday, just what all he had to say coming off his first spring at JMU, him getting back into the Sun Belt and really probably settling in, I would imagine, a little bit. It's starting to probably feel like this is home for him a little bit at this point with, being here for a few months and getting acclimated to the job.
Yeah, I will have plenty of stories from our conversation with him or my conversation with him. I'm starting it out. I'll have one hopefully in Monday's paper, so Sunday online maybe. I don't know. I don't know what the weekend at the DNR looks like. So early next week about just kind of him and growing up around the game of football with, his dad being a coach and his little brothers being coaches as well. So you'll get to learn a little bit more about Billy Napier, more so the person than just the football coach. And then from there, obviously talking about kind of his whole journey of one of the things I really wanted to ask him about was what makes a good job versus what makes a job that you kind of hesitate and think, oh, maybe this isn't the right one. And, you know, it kind of went along with what he's talked about in the spring already of he wants to see that alignment at the top and see the buy-in from the administration. And, I think everybody who's listening to our podcast has probably seen the angry Florida fans that think that he's taking shots at Florida for being broken and for having these problems. And I think we've probably talked about it at this point on the show already, but it's not necessarily a dig at Florida. I think it's just the truth of any coach who gets hired to take over a job of a program that has lost over the last couple of years. Like, he was replacing a coach who got fired for lack of production. And it is different than what he's doing now of taking over a program that lost its coach because he got a better job. So he did talk quite a bit about that and the fact that a good job like the one at JMU, in his opinion, is because there is that buy-in from kind of the entire community, not just the administration. He likes the fact that players who come to JMU have such they really carry the identity of the Valley's team and they want to represent that. So that was, one area that we went deeper on, and even kind of in the same realm of talking about the differences between coaching in the SEC and coaching in the group of 5 level or group of 6 level now. But he did even kind of say it that coaching at this level, there's a little bit more purity to it. And it's not just like this gigantic show almost. So yeah, it was a really in-depth conversation, a lot of different things that we talked about, trying to think if there's anything big that I missed over it. But yeah, it's going to be a fun one to keep taking through that conversation for the next couple of days.
Yeah. Expanding on that conversation a little bit about, what makes it a good job and SEC versus, Sun Belt or programs, conferences on that level. I do find it kind of interesting, like the purity of it. Like it does still resemble, I guess, college football a little bit at the Sun Belt level, even as they try to, not necessarily keep up. I mean, even had like ADs say we're not trying to keep up with the Power Four at this point. But you do have programs like JMU that are making a significant investment, and they want their Saturday afternoons to be a show, kind of to borrow that term that you just used, but in a different way, I guess. And I've always kind of thought it's really interesting that of all the major sports, college football seemed to be the first one to really kind of just totally embrace yeah, we're a TV program, and TV producers are driving what we're doing here, and how this sport's going to go. And yeah, maybe that's a little bit less at the Sun Belt level, which I can see that probably making a coach happier. You got to deal with a lot, but it's different than, just being kind of like a second pro league.
Well, it's interesting too, earlier on when we had talked about why he went into college coaching, his dad was a high school football coach, so he grew up around high school football, but he quickly realized that he loved recruiting, and that's something that you don't get at the high school level if, you're a public school coach, especially. And for the longest time, he thought he was going to go be a teacher and a coach and kind of follow the same path as his dad. But he really liked that recruiting element at the college level. And I think, he didn't necessarily bring that back up when talking about coaching at the group of 5 level. But in today's realm, you get an opportunity to recruit a lot at JMU's level because of the fact that you're constantly having this roster turnover every year. So it is something too that makes it an interesting job for him, just because of the fact that he does value the recruiting and going out on the trail and meeting these guys and having them kind of build that relationship to commit to the program and the coaching staff.
Yeah. And it probably too, like you talk about recruiting, and I'm just sitting here thinking about traditional recruiting where it used to be like, okay, we want a guy to come see our campus and see our team, and we're going to maybe offer them a scholarship, and our scholarship versus their scholarship basically is the thing. And I mean, there is NIL, there is rev share at football at JMU, but there's also a lot of players on the roster where that's not like the driving thing. Even more than like, basketball for JMU, when you're talking about 10 to 12 players that you're trying to like get paid for men's and women's basketball, that completely changes the way you're recruiting your entire team. And I think, we see a little frustration from that with Preston Spradlin because it's not the job he was brought up to do. It's not the recruiting he used to do. I do think it's probably like different for football at JMU versus a place like Florida where, you're talking about like multi-million dollar rosters. Whereas at JMU, you're just kind of like, yeah, you got to, recruit your quarterback, and that probably involves, some money and negotiations and things like that. But there's a lot of guys on the roster where like, yeah, they just want to come on a recruiting visit and get offered a scholarship. And, maybe in 2 years that changes and they're looking somewhere else for money. But like, it's still a little bit more the traditional thing, I think, for football at the G6 level. Just because like the roster sizes mean you can't give everybody $1 million.
And I think that's where the purity of it comes in. It's like you still have a team of guys that are playing the game because they probably love the game more so than they're playing it to get that paycheck. And so you're seeing guys who like the brotherhood element, who like being around their teammates and practicing and working to get better. And, I tweeted the video out yesterday, but we, kind of going back to that whole commitment piece and teaching it to his players and making sure that they're buying in. We talked about Blake Kendall, who has since entered the transfer portal as a graduate transfer. And, Napier had nothing but high praise for Blake Kendall and the fact that, he was committed to the program for the 4 years or 4 years. Yeah. Yeah. 4 years that he was here, and he got that education, and he's always going to be a JMU Duke. But he was kind of a perfect example of someone that joined the football team, maybe not really expecting to ever be the guy and the starting quarterback for the team, but always showed up to practice, always showed up to get better and to work. And I think that is a player that you can kind of look at and still see that purity of college football in.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And, it kind of allows us to transition a little bit to, like I was saying, it's different for basketball right now, just because of the roster sizes. I think, we see that frustration, especially I think from Preston Spradlin, like on the men's side, where I know this isn't the kind of recruiting he necessarily likes to do. He just wants to stay out of the like money negotiations and everything. But on the flip side, I think Cliff Wood, I think everybody like involved with that side of it for JMU has learned a lot over these past 2 years with rev share and post house and everything. And, we'll see how it looks on the court. But for both JMU men's and women's basketball, it seems like this was a much smoother offseason so far, as they were able to put together rosters. And, you still have to do a massive turnover for the men's team, but maybe a little bit less frustration with like, okay, we're losing this person just because of money than we've seen in the past.
But this kind of goes back even to my conversation with Napier, where I think I saw a lot of Florida fans always saying like, man, he doesn't take any of the blame for what went wrong at Florida. Like he brushes it off, he pushes it on someone else. Napier yesterday with me sat down and he was like, listen, I was stubborn at my last place. And he's like, I recognize that those were mistakes. Like I needed to change things that I did. I think that kind of applies to what maybe the men's basketball team is doing, where, Spradlin realizes he has to be more involved in some of those money conversations just because that is where this is going. And that is what has men's basketball and college basketball has become. If you want to be successful, those are conversations you have to have. So I do think we're starting to see that now, where maybe it was a little bit of a looking in the mirror kind of moment, realizing, hey, I need to kind of change my course on this. Maybe, yes, it's still frustrating that I have to address money when I'm talking to some of these players, but it's going to be what helps set this team up for success.
Yeah, and with Napier, like, I don't know if this came up as much in your recent conversation, but we know, like, when he was first hired, that first few weeks on the job, we heard so much about like just how quickly JMU was able to work with getting visits scheduled, getting people in, signing the deals with them, and just getting that class put together in a warp speed amount of time. And they definitely worked faster in basketball this spring, and I think that was part of it. It may be, like you said, maybe more direct conversations with the coaching staff rather than being like, okay, you guys got to negotiate this. I don't know if that was the case or not, but they made it happen faster, which I know they lost out on people last spring because it was kind of like, trying to negotiate with them, and they end up just signing a deal with somebody else. And then, a week or two later, Jamie's like, well, we got the money, but like that guy's gone. And it's that I think was very frustrating for a lot of people in the AUBC last spring. And I don't think they dealt with that anywhere near as much this spring. They still got to fill through a couple more spots for basketball, for men's basketball. But, they have a team that could compete in the Sun Belt right now, at least on paper, regardless of who else they get. And, I'd have to go back and check the exact calendar, but like, I feel like last year at this time, we were wondering, okay, who are they going to get? Like they had a few guys, but it was just, you'd hear about somebody coming to visit and then that would never come to fruition. And it snapped into place really this year. And then the women's side, like very quickly, you only had to like go out and get 3 players, but like, it just was like clockwork that you basically had, Sean O'Regan early in the spring, he told me, he's like, well, look what we lost. We got to replace 38 points and 19 rebounds. And, you almost like to the exact number went out and got players that did that last year at their previous places with their averages. And, it was smooth sailing for the women's team too.
When talking about the speed of getting this all done and getting these rosters set, I'm obviously as I've been reminded today on my social media, I am 6 years out from graduating college to the day, but I'm still not too far removed of remembering what that mindset was when you're in college and trying to figure out what your future looks like. Getting these things done with speed, I promise, is like what every college age person hopes for. I don't think, if you're a player trying to find your next landing spot, that period of uncertainty where you're not officially on the roster, I cannot imagine how much stress that is and kind of anxiety inducing. So you kind of, as a coaching staff, you need to work fast because they want to work fast too, to kind of eliminate that stress of not having a home and not having a roster and a place to work and teammates to know and kind of build that bond with. So I think, the game itself and the transfer portal has started to speed up just because of the age and the generation that is currently in it. It's just they want that comfort of having a place to land.
Yeah, and that goes into something, I just went and talked to Bree Robinson to Kai Stevenson on the women's basketball team the other day, and the stories to come, but like about them choosing to come back to JMU. They've both been in the portal before, and they both talked about like, yeah, it's really stressful when you're in the portal and like you're finishing up school someplace where you don't really feel like you're supposed to be there. And you can't necessarily just go in the gym and shoot if you want to. If your hamstring feels tight, you can't just like run to the trainer because you're not part of the team anymore, but you're still there because you're finishing school. You're figuring out where you're going next. And not only that, like, you're dealing with those negotiations. You're talking to them about like basketball stuff. You're also like okay, will I make my decision in time to get a roommate and an apartment and everything? And like, it is stressful, I think, for the players too, like on that side of things. So like you said, everybody wants it to go fast, and it did for JMU this time around. It went pretty fast. Like I said, we'll see a couple more spots filled for the men, but for the most part, they got things done quickly, and are able to kind of move forward.
Yeah, I think about like even small things of like moving back down here when I got this job, like you said about like finding an apartment, finding somewhere where you're gonna live that you can have kind of your life set. It's so stressful, and it was like for me, it was a month of anxiety. It felt like day and night. So it is one of those things where maybe if you are a coach, it does. If you want to get it done fast, it bodes well for you because I think just naturally everybody wants to have it figured out as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Another thing, before we wrap this up, Jamie's trying to figure out quickly as possible is how they're going. I mean, I think it's done. It's a foregone conclusion now that Bridgeport Stadium will eventually be expanded. There's going to be a lot of stuff going up around Bridgeport Stadium with the master plan for the university approved late last month at the Board of Visitors meeting, or endorsed, I guess is the correct term for what the Board of Visitors voted on. But it allows President Jim Schmidt, Matt Roan, everybody involved to kind of move forward with making it happen. I talked to Matt Roan the other day, and there wasn't a lot of new stuff about the stadium, but the one thing, basically where they're at right now is like he's got the authority now to go find the funds to make this happen. It's going to involve a private-public partnership, which is allowed under law in Virginia at this point, to kind of find a developer and architects and everything that are willing to kind of work with JMU, as far as like where that money comes from. Maybe they're putting up some of the money on their end. There's obviously going to be like a drive for donations and things like that to pay for this, but we will start to hear more, I think, in the next 6 months to a year about like the actual cost, the actual money, where it's coming from, and when they're going to start breaking ground on not just Bridgeport Stadium, but like a lot of things around Bridgeport, including, apartments and shopping and restaurants and all kinds of things to turn it into a stadium district on campus and really make the middle of JMU's campus look a lot different than it does right now.
I swear. It's having, have I feel like this is probably a universal feeling for anybody in their college campus, but you always when you're in school, you always hear the alumni say, "Oh, it looks so different now than when I was in school." Now working in the town that I went to college in, is so interesting to me because like I look at these, the master plan and how they're, trying to figure this out. And I start feeling that and I'm like, I'm going to become that alumni that says, "Oh well, when I was in school, this didn't look anything like it." And JMU is on that track right now. And I think it's, even from our conversations last year with Matt Roan at the end of the year about what they were potentially looking at for the stadium and, having study spaces. So students who are walking from the College of Business and connecting to main campus have somewhere where they can even stop in and do schoolwork during the week, or having food options that are open during the week, then connected to the stadium. So it's generating some money. It is interesting to see kind of, that next level thinking that this administration is trying to bring in to create the best possible outcome from this for the school. And I think right now you're starting to see the benefit of having a guy in charge like Jim Schmidt as well, who already has that experience of building a high level athletic facility at his past institution. So I think that pairing of him and Roan right now is showing to at least be forward thinking with how they're trying to get this done.
Yeah, and I think like you hit on it there too, and I don't even know if you meant to, but like you said, what's best for the school. And it's not just a football thing right now. Like obviously, adding more seats to Bridgeport and adding more suites and everything else is going to be a huge part of it. That's going to be something that everybody takes notice of when all of a sudden you've got maybe 35,000 people in a stadium on Saturday rather than 25,000. But it's all part of like I said, it's the master plan, and it's interesting because, you know, they want to eventually have about 30,000 students enrolled at JMU, maybe not to like 2040 or so, but that's what they're going for. They also want to have a higher percentage of students living on campus, and that's an academic thing. Like, Jim Schmidt really believes that like students do better when they live on campus. And so like it's all going to be part of it. Like, if there's an apartment building next door to Bridgeford Stadium with, a sports bar at the bottom and, a Target or whatever it might end up being, like that's all part of like trying to keep people on campus, which is, part of the academic mission as much it is like, hey, it'll be really cool to have all this stuff next to a football stadium that's going to be packed with more people. Yeah, that's part of it. But it really is like when you start to talk to Jim Schmidt, especially, you kind of get to see his vision of like how this all is intertwined. And it's like, it's all intertwined with like the desire to become a Research One university and things like that. And it's not just like, okay, we got to do this for football or we're going to get left behind.
Well, and it's even for the people maybe who, haven't been at the school in terms of an academic setting in a long time. You mentioned wanting people to live on campus and having, kind of an apartment set up for those people. The general rule at JMU is you're on campus your freshman year and you can sign a second year housing contract. You're not necessarily guaranteed a spot your second year, depending on how many people sign the contract. And even then, I lived on campus for 2 years, but JMU only has one building that you can live in that's kind of that traditional apartment style where you maybe feel a little bit less like you're a college freshman living in just like your small, tiny, cramped dorm and you have to rely on, going to the dining hall for food. So they only have one of those. So like if you introduce that idea of having a second kind of apartment style dorm on campus, next to the football field, like you said, it does encourage people to maybe look to stay on campus longer. And it's something that, having experienced JMU from that side, it is something that maybe they have been missing. And it seems like President Jim Schmidt has noticed that one pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, we'll have some more stuff to talk about from I think both the Napier and Roan conversations here in the next couple weeks. We can save those for future episodes. Go ahead and wrap this one up in time to go watch some JMU lacrosse on TV here in a little bit. But I'm Shane Metlin, been here with Katie Harper. You've been listening to Purple and Bold from DNR Media. Search DN-R Media on all the podcast platforms, YouTube. Hit like, subscribe, comment. All that stuff moves us up your algorithm, so you find all this good JMU content wherever you're listening or watching us. And thanks for tuning in.